Hey guys, Nike here. Today's build really needs no introduction, but I'm going to do one anyway. Insofar as there is anything resembling a meta for open world solo builds, this one is undoubtedly at or very near the top. I'm talking about the shortbow Condi Renegade, and I can say that without a doubt, it is one of the most overpowered builds in the entire game. It dominates its game mode in a way that no other build dominates its game mode. And this is proven by some of the most insane videos of solo and duo boss kills that we've ever seen out there from members of the community. For example, Mighty Tiamat and Lederhosen did a Bone Skinner duo video with two Condi Renegades. Lord Heisen is a YouTuber, and he really popularized the build for the mainstream. And you can go to his channel and see some of the absolutely insane boss solos that you can do with it at a high level. So what the hell makes this build so good? If you watched my Soul Beast video from a few weeks ago, you are familiar with how tanky you can make a Condi build without compromising DPS in a meaningful way. And this build takes that to a whole other level by adding in a ton of self-healing that almost no other build can rival. And even better than that Soul Beast build, this build can self-buff additionally in a great way. So as you can see from the video here, I am soloing a bounty boss. I've never fought this boss before, and I had no idea what its mechanics were beforehand. This isn't a fight I practiced for, and I was simply able to do the fight sight unseen on my first attempt without tailoring my build at all for it. The build is really just that good that you can just roll up to a champion bounty boss and solo it yourself. Another factor is that the build only really needs two of its trait lines and one of its legends to function at the most basic level, whereas most every build can only swap in a utility skill or two in order to adapt to a specific challenge. But this build can swap an entire trait line, and along with that, it can swap its legend as well to get a level of adaptability for any given situation that other builds can really only dream of. So what this means at the end of the day is that this build does it all with very few compromises. It isn't very often that I can recommend a build that has literally no meaningful drawbacks, but I'm happy to be able to do that today. So with that said and that out of the way, let's get right into the build. Alright guys, so gear. We are going to use full Trailblazers in every slot. I've said it before, but Trailblazers is the most broken stat set in the game. You gain a gigantic amount of defensive stats without giving up as much damage as you might think coming from a Viper setup. Vipers does have a lot of power and precision, but in Condi builds, the skills that you use to inflict Condis usually, but not always, scale poorly with power, so they don't hit very hard even with Vipers. So in those cases, swapping to Trailblazers keeps 90% of your damage, but gives you 300% more survivability, which in open world or solo adventures is a trade that you are willing to make. So our weapon set is just going to be a single shortbow with Sigil of Bursting. Let me scroll this up. Sigil of Bursting and Sigil of Malice. You can use a Mason Axe on swap if you like, and if this was a Viper build, I'd actually recommend that because it has a lot more burst potential. But in this build, it wouldn't do a ton for your damage, and in fact, many scenarios it would be a DPS loss. So all you really need to play this build to its fullest potential is a shortbow, just one. If you are a super tryhard, you can definitely use a second shortbow on swap with Corruption Sigil and a Bursting Sigil. Build up to 25 Corruption stacks in whatever map you're in, and then switch to your main weapon, shown here, for the huge damage gains of an extra 250 con damage stat. But really, that's unnecessary. So I'd only really recommend it if you fall in love with the build and want it to be your main build, so you go into turbo min-max mode with it. Alright, for runes, we are going to take Superior Rune of the Nightmare. Before anyone asks, there really isn't a good alternative to Nightmare Rune. Every other option is inferior in one way or another. Tormenting might be a decent second option, especially if you want even more sustain, but it does cost a pretty significant amount of damage potential. There are tons of ways in the game to get the Twilight Arbor tokens that you need to get Nightmare runes, and you might actually find that you enjoy the different ways to obtain Twilight Armor dungeon tokens, and that would be a great experience for you to avail yourself of. So that's basically it for gear. So let's talk about food. We hit the Condi duration cap with about 60 expertise, which means that foods with 100 expertise main stat are a bit wasted for us. And thus, the best food that we can take are plates of beef rendang. Unfortunately, this food is a bit of a pain in the ass to craft, but there are several foods that give 100 Condi damage main stat with a variety of secondary stats, all of which are more or less useful. For utility consumable, as is the case with any Trailblazer build, Magnanimous Tuning Crystals are best in slot and will give you more extra Condi damage than any other utility food that you can get. With that said, one of the few weaknesses of this build is that you don't have a lot of blocks or evade frames other than your two dodges. And you have only a minimal access to Vigor. So for particularly tough content, you might want to try to use Orient Truffle and Meat Stew Food, which gives you 40% faster endurance regen. And that might be the type of thing that gets you through a difficult situation otherwise. But really, that is it for gear and food. So with that said, let's move on to traits where things start to get really interesting. Okay, so for traits, the base of our build is Devastation and Renegade. And the third trait line is honestly swappable, like I said before. But generally speaking, the default choice is Corruption. I'm aware that you can even swap out Renegade for Herald and get a ton more boon support, but that's more of a subject for another video rather than this one, because that kind of changes the build in a very big way since you don't get to use Shortbow anymore. Nonetheless, for today we'll be talking about Devastation, Corruption, and Renegade, because that will get you through 99% of PvE, open world, and solo content. Devastation is normally a DPS line for Revenant, but since we're taking the bottom trait choice, the Battle Scar choices, it becomes a defensive trait line, in fact. These three traits, Battle Scarred, Thrill of Combat, and Dance of Death, combine to provide us with an insane amount of sustain. Essentially, each stack of Battle Scars that we build up heals us for 300 HP when we hit with an attack. With these three traits, we get an endless supply of Battle Scar stacks, so we are constantly healing for a ton. The way it works is that with the GM trait, you get a stack of Battle Scars every time you inflict vulnerability on a foe. And when we have the skill on our bar, Ice Razor's Ire, which in fact inflicts a crap ton of vulnerability, we are just constantly building up Battle Scar stacks almost as fast as we can use them, which means we heal a ton, and it becomes very difficult for us to die. We're going to talk a little bit more about the interaction with Ice Razors later and how to use it in the build. But suffice it to say for now that casting Ice Razor's Ire is essentially a burst heal for us with this particular trait combination. With the tankiness of Trailblazer gear, this amount of sustain added on top makes us very hard to kill. It is very difficult in a full Trailblazer build to be one-shot. And as long as you don't get one-shot, with this build, you will heal back to full very quickly. So it becomes this insane combo that builds on each other and makes it so you are essentially invulnerable to all but the most heavy incoming damage. As far as corruption goes, it's a general purpose trait line to boost our Condi damage. We take Acolyte of Torment, Pact of Pain, and either Permeating Pestilence or Diabolic Inferno. I would say that Diabolic Inferno is the default choice. There are a lot of times where you want Permeating Pestilence, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but for the most part, Diabolic Inferno is the standard pick. So basically, Acolyte of Torment gives us more damage with Torment, which is great because we do a lot of Torment damage. Pact of Pain gives us 15% Condi duration boost, which helps us out quite a bit. And Diabolic Inferno, whenever we switch legends, we do AoE Poison, AoE Burning, which is super good, and we try to swap legends on cooldown with this build, so it's just a little bit of extra damage in the mix. Now, when do you want to use Permeating Pestilence? Essentially, if you're in an area where, or a situation where the mobs are inflicting a lot of Condis on you, and the main way you're dying are Condis, you can use Permeating Pestilence to relieve the Condi pressure that you are getting from them. I found it personally useful in doing some particularly tough boss fights where I kept getting crippled by the boss and was making it much harder to kite the boss and fight and stay at range, and I was taking a lot more damage than I wanted to. So I would use Permeating Pestilence to send the cripple back to the boss. Obviously, bosses aren't affected by cripple, but the point is, it is one of the few ways to Condi clear that we have good access to. So if you need it, it's there. So do remember that. In Renegade, we're going to take the pretty standard Condi selection of Blood Fury, Heart Piercer, and Lasting Legacy. Blood Fury gives us big bleed duration, which is very good. Heart Piercer gives us more bleed damage, and Shortbow Piercing, which is very relevant when it comes to tagging situations with lots of mobs. And then Lasting Legacy boosts our Heroic Command, which is one of our biggest self-buffing abilities. A secondary synergy worth mentioning with this trait line is the minor traits, which give us a source of fury and a source of vigor. Additionally, when we're at full endurance, we have 33% more chance to crit. Considering we're a Trailblazer build that has a mere 5% crit chance, going up to 38% crit chance is very meaningful for us, especially if we can also get Fury in the mix. Now we're up to 58% crit chance. And you might say, well, what does crit chance matter? We're not doing hardly any power damage. Well, what it does matter for is maintaining your stacks of Callous Fervor, because you do get those when you crit. So what you will find is with this build that it's not important to have 100% chance to crit. Even a 33% chance to crit is more than enough to keep up the Callous Fervor indefinitely, especially since we're spamming Heroic Command on cooldown, which extends the duration of our Callous Fervor. But it's just nice at the start of a fight to be able to rapidly get 5 stacks of Callous Fervor without having to wait for a slow build up on that. So it is somewhat important to remember to try to avoid using dodges as much as you can, only if you need them for surviving, of course, but because you get that crit chance. So anyway, that's pretty much it for traits. And next we will talk about skills and skill usage. So for the Revenant, The skills that you get on your utility bar are determined by your choice of legend, and in our case, we are taking Kala and Malix. Malix can be swapped if need be. You can swap to Jalis if you need more CC, or Ventari if you need more sustain or projectile defense for some particular reason. But 99% of the time, Malix is your ideal secondary choice. When we're in Malix, let's swap to Malix so I can show you. When we're in Malix, of all the bar skills on the bar, the only one that is super important is your elite, which is Embrace the Darkness, which pulses big AoE torment. You typically will not use Pain Absorption, Banish Enchantment, or Call to Anguish. They're just not particularly awesome in PvE unless you happen to be fighting an enemy that has like a ton of boons and you need to rip the boons. I don't find that these are particularly useful, although the Call to Anguish Leap is sometimes occasionally useful, but again, 99% of the time, the only skill you're going to touch here is Embrace the Darkness. The heal skill, again, we have Battle Scars. We shouldn't need to use Empowering Misery unless we're in a situation where we are very, very pressured and we have still like several seconds left on our cooldown to swap to Renegade. If you are going to die before you can swap back to Renegade and cast Ice Razors, then I would then use Empowering Misery. But I would definitely try to get used to not using Empowering Misery if you can absolutely avoid it. So Kala is where things get a little bit more interesting for us because the skills become very situationally useful. Ironically, our heal skill, Breakrazor's Bastion, is one of the worst uses of our energy that we have because we get so much of our healing from Ice Razor's Ire, as we talked about before. Because of that, you should almost never use Breakrazors. So the irony, and also we get a lot of healing through our Elite, which we will talk about in a little bit. But so between Ice Razors and our Elite, Breakrazors becomes like, despite being our heal skill, almost our worst option for healing. Which is funny. Not many other builds you can say that. So then we also have Razor Claw's Rage, which you would think, oh, this is a Condi build. This is going to do a lot of damage for us. It's going to have bleeds. Unfortunately, there's an ICD on it. You can only inflict 1 bleed per second, and it pulses 10 times. So you're going to get a whopping 10 bleeds from this, and they are not particularly long-lasting bleeds either. So it is very much not a great use of your energy. And when you're solo, chances are the target you're fighting isn't going to be capped on vulnerability. And vulnerability is a much bigger damage increase than a few bleeds. Each stack of vulnerability that you are applying is going to be another 1% multiplicative damage boost. So you really want as much vulnerability as possible. So if you only have a limited amount of energy, Ice Razors is just the way to go, totally. Not to mention, Ice Razors is your healing skill in a sense. So it's not only your biggest damage boost utility skill, but it's also your healing skill. And therefore, it is worth using Ice Razor's Ire on cooldown whenever you can. Dark Razor's Daring is a very good skill situationally because it is a big AoE CC, which is nice for dealing with large groups of trash mobs before they can hurt you, especially if they are fairly dangerous veterans or elites. A lot of times in HOT maps where there are some kind of nasty groups of trash mobs, just casting Dark Razor's Daring as like your opener as you go into the fight is enough to get you through without even being hit once, and that's very helpful. So It's not the sort of thing that you're going to want to use a lot during fights. It's not something you're going to cast regularly, but in certain situations, it's a great way to engage and start your fight. And lastly, our elite is Soul Cleave Summit. Soul Cleave Summit is actually kind of like our oh shit healing skill. There are times when Ice Razor's ire is on cooldown, and we still need more healing, or Ice Razor's simply isn't enough to handle the incoming pressure, and in those cases, we turn on our elite and we let it run down, and we attack, and we do all our things with it, and basically it gives you a life steal with no ICD. So all of our skills, 7-shot shoots 7 arrows. It will life steal 386 life times 7. So just using your 7-shot with Soul Cleave Summit on, you will burst heal 2k life. I've been in many situations where I've been down to like 3k HP, and I cast Ice Razors and Soul Cleave at the same time, one after the other, and I do a 7-shot, and I am immediately back to full health. So these are sort of, you don't really want to always use Soul Cleave Summit. It's not something that you're just going to use in every situation, because really using it prevents you from really spamming your attack skills. So you really want to be judicious with your Soul Cleave Summit. It's really only for insane healing, but remember it's there, and remember to use it when needed. Okay, so for our F skills, the go-to that you always want to use on cooldown is Heroic Command. Heroic Command keeps our stacks of Callous Fervor up, which is a good thing, and it also gives us 15 stacks of Might. Going from 0 Might to 15 Might is a huge damage increase. So you always want to use Heroic Command on cooldown to make sure that you are keeping your Might up while you're in combat, because it will help you out a ton in terms of DPS. Orders from Above, which is the Alacrity skill that you will tend to use in Fractals or Raids, is almost never used while solo, because actually our bread and butter skills, our bow skills, they're on a low cooldown anyway. And the energy cost of Orders of Above just really isn't going to increase our DPS very much, and we almost never have enough energy to use it. So it's really not worth using. Orbital Bombardment or Citadel Bombardment, I should say, is a decent damage skill for us. However, it's rarely worth spending energy on, because simply put, your bow skills are going to do more damage than Citadel Bombardment. So if given the choice between spending 35 energy on Citadel Bombardment or 7 energy on a 7-shot, you're going to take that 7-shot every day. Or even more comparatively, Spirit Crush, which will do significantly more damage than Citadel Bombardment. The exception to that is Citadel Bombardment is not a bad opener for a fight. Since you go back up to 50% energy when you swap legends, you can start fights on the legend that you don't want to open with. Let's say you wanted to open on Kala, so what you would do is you would start on Malix, cast Citadel Bombardment, and then swap to Kala and go right back up to 50% and then use your Kala skills. So you essentially get a free Citadel Bombardment out of the deal. But that's really just kind of a niche thing. And honestly, once you're into the meat of a fight, it's almost never worth using it. So you can really kind of just be in the habit of not using it. So really that's it for our utility skill choices. We will talk about how you actually do damage and the right way to play the build next. So as always, in this series, I will not be showing a DPS rotation on the DPS Golem for this build or any other builds. The fact is that when playing solo, stuff either dies incredibly quickly with no matter what skills you use, or it requires too much movement, dodging, blocking, etc., to really qualify as a rotation. What matters most is getting your high damage skills off during windows of opportunity, and this usually entails landing some very specific combos, and that's what I want to discuss. So for this build, there are some very simple things that you need to remember. First, you need to use Heroic Command, one of your F skills, off cooldown. Second, you need to use Ice Razor's Ire off cooldown. And lastly, 7-Shot, Bow 3, is your highest DPS skill, and it hits physically 7 times, so it can burst heal you with Battle Scars, and thus, it is your highest priority damage skill. You want to use Bloodbane Path, Bow 2, and Spirit Crush, Bow 4, as well if they are off cooldown and if you have the energy. When you run out of energy, or when your legend is available, you should swap. And when you swap to Malix, you should turn on the Elite and use Heroic Command and your bow skills as normal. When you run out of energy on Malix, it should be right about when you swap, when your Elite swap or when your Legend swap comes off cooldown. You can swap back to Kala, cast Ice Razor's Ire, and continue spamming Heroic Command in your bow skills, while using your Elite skill on Kala as needed. Honestly, it sounds a bit more complicated than other builds, but it really isn't in practice because you don't have to swap weapons. And the energy management is a fair bit easier than it sounds. Once you play with this build for a few minutes, you will get the hang of it and understand how to be able to cast your Heroic and Ice Razors on cooldown while also using your bow skills as fast as you can off cooldown. So that's it, guys. I hope you really enjoyed this build guide, and I hope that any of you solo Renegade players out there really get some value out of this. I know this is a very well-known and popular build in the solo PvE community, so I look forward to hearing from the vets, especially on this one, who will have some tips to share with us for sure. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you guys for tuning in so much, and I will see you next time. Thank you.